Welcome back, friends. This is the Brick City Brown Chick podcast. This is season 2, episode 2, For the Love of a Black Woman. The genesis of this episode started a few weeks ago when I saw Doug Emhoff's speech, who is the husband of Vice President Kamala Harris, at the Democratic National Committee's convention. I had heard the story of how they were set up and how they met before, but hearing it in his own words was super interesting. And I knew I would end up doing something with it for my podcast, but at that point in time, I wasn't sure what that would be. Flash forward a couple of weeks to Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson talking about her new autobiography, which is called Lovely One, which is the translation of her first name and her middle name. And seeing her do the Sunday talk shows talking about her relationship with her husband, how they met at Harvard, and how they became a couple and got engaged and got married. Those two things, I had a pretty good idea of how they went together and what I would talk about. But then the death and the conversation afterwards this past week about James Earl Jones sort of put it all into perspective for me. Now, you're probably thinking, how are those three things related? We understand the first two, maybe, but the third one's kind of off in left field. So let me explain. From the perspective of a Black woman who, in about 2.5 weeks, will be celebrating 25 years of marriage to my husband, who is a white man, the relationships between Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff and Ketanji Brown Jackson and her husband Patrick Jackson have been fascinating to watch. From their perspectives, they are two couples living their lives who are happy and blessed and love each other and understand each other. And that is my husband and I as well. But of course, their relationships, as do mine, have an added component of race. Ketanji Brown Jackson, in her book, talked about how her parents felt about her marrying Patrick. And what her parents said to her was, look, I trust you and I trust Patrick, but this is America. And she knew exactly what they meant. And just like when I heard it, I knew exactly what her parents meant. It was not unlike the reaction of my own mother. She was happy for me. She was happy for my husband. She was happy that his mother and his grandmother, who are the only two people's opinions in his family that he cared about, that they were happy. But as she pointed out, as a person who grew up in the Jim Crow South, this is America, right? And we can pretend that race is not still a thing, but we all know is it's still a thing. And if we didn't know that before this week, with all the misinformation, disinformation, and flat out lies about Haitian migrants eating people's pets, we're all real clear now that race is still a big issue in America. So, of course, the basic fundamental question is, why do people like to pretend it's not a thing? This is the land of great opportunity. And America, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, what people called America was a melting pot, right? That the idea behind a melting pot is everybody gets together, you throw it all in the soup, and everybody mixes and figures it out and learns how to coexist and how to accept each other. But the reality of America is it's not a melting pot. It's much more like, if we're going to continue the cooking analogy, let's call it a casserole. You threw a bunch of things together in a pot and hope it turns out okay. And sometimes it does. And more often than not, it doesn't. Jimmy Carter has a famous saying that people can go and move to other countries. Like, for example, you can move to France, or you can move to England, or you can move to Russia. But the reality is, even if you live there, you will never be a Frenchman, you will never be an Englishman, you will never be a Russian. But what makes America unique is that anybody can move here or be born here, and regardless of their ethnicity or race, they can become an American because America is a country purposely made up of all kinds of different people. Now, in recent years, with the rise of the MAGA movement and the resurrection of groups like the KKK and the new groups like the Proud Boys and people like that, some Americans, I'll say, have decided that the only true Americans are white and also are Christian. People have been making statements that they're proud to be Christian nationalists and that America was meant to be a Christian country. Okay, these are clearly people who don't read not only regular, world history, but American history, because people fled England so they could start a new country so that they could worship the way they wanted to worship. It was not specific to Christianity. But because America has a tendency to not learn from its past, as the saying goes, history repeats itself because nobody listened the first time. Because we don't learn our lessons, we are back to the 1940s and the 1950s and the belief that America should be homogeneous, that America should be a country where everybody acts the same, everybody practices the same religion, everybody learns the same information in school or now does not learn the same information in school. It's just become a very topsy-turvy place. But what has also simultaneously happened over the last 40 to 50 years is there has been a significant increase in interracial marriage. So in the 1960s, when Mildred and Richard Loving had to petition the Supreme Court in a case called Loving v. Virginia to make interracial marriage legal, there needed to be a federal law to supersede the laws of the states, mostly in the South. Richard and Mildred Loving lived in Virginia, so the case is called Loving v. Virginia, to make sure that interracially married couples had the same rights and privileges as any other married couple. Whenever you talk to people about marriage law and new marriage law, the first thought that comes to mind is gay people, right? Because 2013 is when gay marriage was legalized on the federal level. What a lot of people don't understand is that the protections of interracial marriage are just 50 years old. They go back to 1967. So, in a few years, it'll be 60 years that interracial couples have had the same rights and privileges as white couples, to be perfectly honest. So, what did that change mean? It meant that interracial couples could marry without the fear of people from their state ripping them out of bed and throwing them in jail, which is what happened to Richard Loving after he married Mildred Loving. He was torn out of his bed in the middle of the night and thrown in jail because he was breaking the law of Virginia. So as I look at Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff and Ketanji Brown Jackson and Patrick Jackson, as a Black woman who has been in that exact scenario, I understand to a certain extent what they have been through. Now, it was, I won't say easier, but it was less complicated for Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff because they were older people. She was nearly 50 when she married him. She'll be 60 this year. They just celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. He was married before. At the time they married, he had teenage children. She had never been married and had no children. So I'm not saying it was easy for them to blend their families and make all that work, but it was less tricky for them because they were both already established. Where Ketanji Brown Jackson and Patrick Jackson met in college. They were young people just starting out in the world and in their lives. And they went on to have two daughters of their own. And so they really were starting from ground zero in terms of how people would view them and how people would accept them. My husband and I were somewhere in the middle. We married in our late 20s. So, yes, we were both out on our own, away from home, taking care of ourselves, but we were still young. Neither of us really had any money because we worked, jobs that young people work. And so it was a mixed bag for us in terms of how we would be seen and how the world would accept us. That was not a big concern for either of us because, as people in our late 20s, we were both pretty positive about who we are and accepting who we are. And our attitude was really the attitude of 20 somethings, which is if you like us, great. And if you don't, the hell with you. Like, we're not worried about it. Now, you can have feelings like that and build your relationship like that so long as you live in a world that works for you. Now, what do I mean by that? A great example is when we got married, my mother said, "Why don't you move to Atlanta?" Because in the early 2000s and even the late 90s when we got married, Atlanta was like the it place for a young, upwardly mobile Black professional. Like, Atlanta was the place to be. And my immediate question to her was, "Mom, where exactly are my husband and I? By the way, my husband is white. Where are we supposed to live in Atlanta?" Now, for all its openness and willingness to accept Black professionals, the Atlanta suburbs, especially the northern suburbs, are notorious for not accepting people. I don't know if it still goes on, but back in the early 2000s, they were building communities in the northern suburbs, and Black people, would tell stories of moving in and having crosses burned on their lawn, which is a fine how do you do to the neighborhood. And my husband and I had just zero interest in dealing with that kind of nonsense. So we've always lived places where there is open diversity, where all kinds of people live together and accept each other, which again is what America as a whole is supposed to be. But I've been to lots of places in my life where that is not the norm, that is the exception. So we've always been blessed and lucky that way that we've made those choices, but not everybody is in a position to make those choices. Now, your question is okay, I get what you're saying about Ketanji Brown Jackson and Patrick Jackson and Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff. What does that have to do with James Earl Jones? What that has to do with is James Earl Jones was married twice in his life. The first marriage didn't last long, maybe a couple of years. But his second marriage, he was married to a white woman, and they were married for 34 years before she died of cancer in 2016. Okay, as half of an interracial couple, I have no problem with that. But what Black women online, especially Black women, but other people too online, started to talk about this week is some of the comments James Earl Jones made during his lifetime about Black women specifically. And he said things like he had no interest in dating Black women because they were uppity, because they were loud, because they didn't appreciate, what the Black men did for them. And this really set off a firestorm with people. And it was kind of a dual problem. The first question is always, do you continue to hold someone responsible for the things they said after they die? And is immediately after their death the time to talk about that? So that's one part. But the other part was really that this triggered generational hurt, I call it, among Black women because yet again, we were the scapegoats. Like who we are as women was seen by, in this case specifically, James Earl Jones, as not good enough for him. In a very similar way, Sidney Poitier, who was married to a white Canadian actress for many years, had said similar things about Black women. Now, at the end of the day, there's a lot of discussion and conflict between Black women and Black men in terms of who dates who marries who, and who gets to judge whether that's okay or not okay. The frustration I've heard a lot of Black women express is, to paraphrase, Black men have been marrying white women for generations, and that's been perfectly okay. Now, it hasn't been perfectly okay to Black women, but it's been perfectly okay to society because society sees that as Black men trying to improve their station and move up. Okay, we can argue the details of whether that's true or not, and whether that's the way Black men felt that they were marrying up. But for this conversation, that's neither here nor there. Now we are at a point in society, in America, where Black women are choosing to marry white men And now all of a sudden, this is an issue for not just for Black men, primarily for them, but also for society. Society sort of looks at Black women marrying white men as trying to move up in the world, trying to improve their station. The same way Black women looked at Black men marrying white women. But because it's now Black women, now all of a sudden that's not okay. And people have all kinds of questions about why this is suddenly a thing and why this is suddenly okay. So what I want to say, just to put my opinion in this situation, is A, most Black women who marry not just white men, but men of any other race means two things. Well, one thing it doesn't mean is that it doesn't mean we are self-hating, which I've heard a lot, or that we hate Black men. That's not the case. Number two, what it means is we want to marry the person we love. And for us, race is not a barrier to that love. Now, I have had some heated conversations with a couple of Black female friends of mine who feel like the only person that they could ever marry is a Black man because they feel like doing anything else would be a disservice to the Black race. I honestly have never understood that argument. They feel like uh, being in a relationship with someone who isn't Black does a disservice to the Black family. And what I have said and have always said is you are Black, meaning the person in the relationship. Therefore, your family is a Black family. Now, the basis for this feeling is American law, America, this is the country that said if you have 1/10 or 1/64th drop of Black blood, you are Black. So if you are Black and you are having children, even if the person you're having that child with is white, Asian, Spanish, whatever, that child is Black. So therefore, you are a Black family. Is this a hard concept for Black people? For some Black people, sure. Is this a hard concept for white people? Absolutely. I have heard numerous discussions about and also with children of interracial marriage. And some of them feel very strongly that they are Black because whichever parent is Black. Some of them feel very strongly that they are mixed, that they are Black and whatever their other parent is. So they are Black and white, or they are Black and Hispanic, or Black and Asian. And then I've heard some of the children say that they feel very strongly tied to the other parent's culture, whether that be white or Asian or Hispanic. They feel very tied to that culture. My personal opinion, and you have to remember this is the opinion of someone who does not have children and did not have children on purpose, not because I married a white man, but because I have never wanted children, which seems to be a real hard concept for some people to grasp, but I never have. I have always felt that the parents of those children are doing their children a disservice if they allow that child to believe that they're mixed or that they are the other parent's ethnicity. And the reason I feel like that is just American society. If the child of a black and white person, especially if it's a male child, if they look like the black parent or have similar coloration and they're pulled over, the cops are not going to care that they're half fill in the blank. All the cops are going to see is that person is black. Now, there are people who want to argue with me that that's not true and that's not what goes on, and this is just an exaggeration of America's racial problem. It's not. It's fact. Google the statistics. This is just the reality. And I think this goes back a very long time, but part of this goes back to when Barack Obama was first elected president of the United States in 2008. A lot of white people said, okay, problem solved. We have a black president. That means we're all colorblind. No one is colorblind. Whenever someone says to me, I don't see color, I immediately give them a look because that's a lie. You see me on this podcast, you know that I am a black woman. And as such, you make certain assumptions about me based on what you're seeing. Same thing for me. If I see you and you are a white person, I see that you are a white person. There's nothing wrong with that, but I am going to make certain assumptions about you because you are a white person. Is that fair? No. Is this the way it should be? Should we just look at each other and automatically go, oh, I know a few things? No, but that's human nature. That's just the way things are. So when I hear people talk about, ridiculous things like, why didn't Kamala Harris change her name? Like, if she's married, why didn't she take her husband's name? Okay, that's a real simple answer. She was almost 50 years old when she married him. She was an already established person. She had run for district attorney, an attorney general, and a U.S. senator as Kamala Harris. That's it. It doesn't mean she doesn't love him. It doesn't mean she isn't willing to put her all into the marriage. That's not what it means. It simply means she was an already established professional person, and that's the choice she made. Ketanji Brown Jackson is a different situation. They met in college. I think they married while she was in law school and while he was becoming a doctor. So she was very young. She was just starting out her career. So she kept her name and she took on his name. Therefore, she is Ketanji Brown, to where her parents' child, she's Ketanji Brown Jackson. It's really not as hard as people want to make it, as people want to think about it. In my own situation, I got married at 29 and we were engaged for 2 years. I struggled for a lot of those 2 years deciding whether I was going to change my name or whether I was not going to change my name. And mine wasn't about children because we weren't going to have any. Neither of us wanted children. Mine was about my lineage and my heritage. I have talked before on this podcast that my father and I were very close, and he died when I was 17. So 29, he'd been gone almost 12 years at that point. But retaining his name and my connection to that name was important to me. And interestingly, the way the situation got settled was one day my husband said, have you decided what you're going to do about your name? Because it had been a conversation. And I was like, no, still trying to figure that out. And he said something so simple, yet so profound. He said, listen, you and I are going to become a family. I'm going to belong to you, and you're going to belong to me. And I think the best solution here is for neither of us to give up our names, and that we should have a name that symbolizes that we are a family. And so we both hyphenated our name. My last name is the first part of our name. His last name is the second part of our name. People are always fascinated with the fact that he changed his name. And the question people always ask is, how in the world did you get him to agree to do that? And I always have to laugh because it was his idea. And it is that level of love and devotion and understanding that Black women not only want and need, but deserve. And that is my overall message in this episode is Black women have been through so much, so much. And what we want when we find love is that person that says, I got you, I get you, and I'm going to be here no matter what. And whatever dressing or package or ethnicity or race that person comes in, he will be welcomed with open arms. Ketanji Brown Jackson tells a story in her book of meeting her husband's family for the first time. And this was when they were about to graduate from Harvard. She was going to go to law school. He was going to go to medical school. His family is a very wealthy, old money New England family. And she knew that. And his grandmother had promised to pay for his medical school. And she was concerned that once they met her, even though at that point they knew she was Black, he had told them this, but once they met her, his grandmother would not be willing to pay for his education anymore. And before they went to his parents' house, he said, listen, I'm prepared to do what I need to do. If I have to get a job and work my way through medical school, so be it. But at the end of the day, I choose you. And that's what Black women want, need, and deserve. Someone who says, I choose you. So I hope that discussion helped clear up a few things for everybody. I am super glad to be back. I said this last week. I've done a lot of thinking and soul searching about this podcast. So this is now strictly a YouTube channel. This will make my life a lot simpler. So if you're looking for this podcast, just go to youtube.com/Brick City Brown Chick. If you have trouble finding it, just go to YouTube and stick in the words in the search, Brick City Brown Chick. You'll see an avatar of me pop up. I have a huge afro. It's super cool. I want to thank everybody for joining me this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. New episodes every Thursday, 5 a.m. Eastern Time. Thanks a lot, guys. See you next week.